Hello, my name is Benjamin T. Rancourt, and I'm a professor of philosophy at North Carolina State University. In this video, I want to talk to you about circular explanations and why they can be good. There are a few non-circular explanations for why I'm talking about this in this video. First of all, this is a version of a talk that should have happened at the North Carolina Philosophical Society meeting of 2020. You can probably figure out why that talk didn't actually happen. But another reason is, even though circular explanations sound like they should be vacuous, sound like they should be bad, I actually came across some examples of good circular explanations. And so in this video, I want to figure out what's going on there. How is it that some circular explanations are good? First of all, let's lay some groundwork about explanations and circular explanations in particular. The sense of explanation at issue in this lecture includes a few features that separate it from how a lot of people talk about explanation. So I just want to be clear. First of all, when I talk about explanations, I'm talking about the kinds of things that can be responses to questions. In particular, responses to explanation-seeking why questions. Related to that, explanations are the kinds of thing that can satisfy demands for explanation. There are a lot of situations where, for one reason or another, a person demands an explanation or they need an explanation. An explanation is the kind of thing that can fulfill that demand. Furthermore, related to the above two, explanations are given in a context. In the sense in which I'm using the word, there's no such thing as an explanation separate from a context. I'm interested in the kinds of things that are actually presented. I'm concerned with people explaining things to each other, and that always happens in a context. These first three claims you can think of as just separating the type of phenomena I'm talking about from other things that are often talked about under the heading of explanation. But this next claim is going to be more controversial. Here, I'm actually taking a stand on the nature of explanation in general. I'm not just clarifying what area of explanation I'm looking at. That claim is that explanations aim at understanding. In other words, part of what it is to be an explanation is that it tries or is in some sense connected to providing or achieving understanding. Now, I won't argue for this claim here. It's an intuitively plausible claim, and there are various defenses of it. In particular, you can see Stephen Grimm's paper from 2010 and Henk Direct's paper from 2017. Now, following from the above claim, explanations succeed when they produce relevant understanding. And finally, we have the claim that a successful explanation is a good explanation. It's important for us to know what's the difference between a good explanation and a bad one, and in my sense of the term, this is it. Good explanations are successful. Successful at what? Well, successful at achieving their aim, which is to achieve understanding. If you still want further clarification of what we're talking about, it's important to start with the act of explaining. This is central to how I'm thinking about explanation in this video. The act of explaining means answering explanation-seeking why questions. And then an explanation, in those terms, is just what is offered in response to such questions. What is offered to answer those questions. The paradigm case of what I'm talking about goes like this. One person asks, why P? And somebody else responds, P because Q. Now here, why P would be an explanatory why question or an explanation-seeking why question, and then P because Q, uttered in response to that question as an answer to that question, would be the explanation. So to give one more concrete example, why is the figure on the left apparently not looking at the figure on the right? And an explanation might be, she's not looking at the figure on the right because the best stock photo I could find of someone who looks like they're asking a question wasn't looking directly to the right. So there you have it. It's going to turn out to be useful to get kind of Gricean about explanation. This is going to help answer some questions later on in the video. So, we can say when S explains YP to R, in general, what's going on is S utters Q with the intention of inducing in R understanding YP by means of the recognition of this intention. This is deliberately similar to Grice's definition of speaker meaning in his 1989 book. You can find that definition on page 219. But what this pseudo-Gricean account of explanation is saying is that when you answer someone's explanatory why question, you utter something in response. And what you're trying to do, because the aim of explanation is understanding, you're trying to get them to understand. They're asking YP, you're trying to get them to understand YP. That's your intention in uttering what you utter. And furthermore, part of your intention is you intend that they're going to understand because you have that very intention. It's their recognition that you intend for them to understand that helps bring about their understanding. So I hope at this point it's clear what I'm talking about, what phenomenon I'm talking about when I say explanation, what it is I'm trying to explain. Before moving on, I want to point out some things that are not my focus. I'm not focused on any kind of ideal total explanation that answers all possible explanatory why questions. I'm not concerned with what a perfect ideal total explanation would look like. I'm also not interested in a full characterization of all the background conditions that allow an answer to be satisfying. I'm mostly concerned with, can this be a satisfactory answer to an explanation-seeking why question? I'm not concerned with filling in all the details for what makes it possible for that to be a good answer. And finally, I'm not interested in categorizations of pairs of propositions as explanatory or not, independent of context. So a lot of theories of explanation try to do this. They try to say, is P an adequate explanation of Q? And they try to treat this as a purely logical relation that's independent of any explanatory context. Now, I'm not going to be concerned with any theory along those lines, not directly at any rate. And now, if you'll permit me, I'm going to make a bold claim that's controversial, and I won't defend it, and it won't play a role in the argument here. One of the reasons I'm not focused on these things is I'm suspicious of them in general. I have the sense that these things don't really exist, that explanation just is something that happens in specific contexts among specific people, and that there isn't a context-independent sense of explanation. I should also point out that I'm not restricting myself specifically to scientific explanation. I'm talking about anytime one person explains something to another person. This can include scientific explanation, but it's not restricted to that. With our explanation of explanation out of the way, we can now get to circular explanation. As you might expect, circular explanation takes the form P because P. It should be clear why this counts as circular. But to make it explicit, suppose we start with the question, why P? And then we get the answer, P because P. Now, if you wanted further explanation for why the explanans is true, how would you ask for it? Well, you would ask, why P? And now we're on a very tiny little circle. One thing I want to highlight here is this is generally considered the worst case scenario for a circular explanation. So this is not, oh, the explanation is technically circular, because if you want to understand why P, you have to see how it fits into this giant web of other propositions with all these complicated connections, and ultimately everything is explained by everything else, so in some loose sense, the explanation for P is circular. It's not like that, so that doesn't seem like necessarily a vicious form of circularity. This would almost always be considered vicious, vacuous, worthless. And the common take on circular explanations, especially circular explanations where the circle is this tiny, is that they belong directly in the trash, and they should stay there. In fact, many theories of explanation take ruling out circular explanations as a desideratum. if any theory of explanation allows circular explanations, most theorists would then simply discard the theory, or at the very least, try to change it to get rid of circular explanations. And yet, I'm claiming that there are good circular explanations. My first example is an example I'm calling the aristocratic party. Suppose we have this situation. Two people are walking through yet another poor neighborhood that's been destroyed by the policies of the aristocratic party. And one person, distressed by the blight they see around them, says, "Why does the aristocratic party support policies that hurt poor people?" And the other person responds, "The aristocratic party supports policies that hurt poor people because the aristocratic party supports policies that hurt poor people." And I hope it's clear that this can be a good explanation, that the first person can come to understand why the party supports these policies on the basis of this circular explanation. Basically, if the explanation is just they support these policies, that gets the first person to realize the reason they support the policies in the first place is because they hurt poor people. That's their goal. They're trying to do this on purpose. It's not that they inadvertently keep choosing policies that hurt poor people accidentally, and she's looking for an explanation why that keeps happening. The response lets her know there is nothing like that. They're being chosen specifically for this reason. So after a little bit of reflection, just thinking about it for a quarter of a second, not really going through any kind of reasoning, she realizes, oh, I get it now. And the explanation works. My second example is an example of a barn. Now, for this example to work, you have to imagine that there's snow all over the place. I couldn't find a good picture of a collapsed barn covered in snow. So just add the snow mentally and we're gonna get through this. All right. So these people are looking at this barn that collapsed under the weight of the snow. And one person asks, why did the barn collapse under the weight of the snow? Now, the people with him look at the old rickety barn that hasn't been kept up in years and can't figure out why this is even a question. So they just say, well, because the barn collapsed under the weight of the snow. And again, this can be a good explanation in some cases. So when they get the response, because the barn collapsed under the weight of the snow, the first person, the person who didn't understand why it collapsed, now suddenly realizes, oh, wait a minute. Of course, this is a poorly built, old, rickety barn. Look at all that snow. Of course it fell. Right. And so once again, they get a circular explanation, but the circular explanation succeeds. It works. They now understand exactly what they needed to understand. My third example is what I'm calling the Honus chair. As far as I know, the Honus chair is not real, and hopefully Honus doesn't mean anything. I didn't intend it to. Suppose you're shopping for chairs online and you come across this chair, the Honus chair, and you have questions about it. So you go to the Honus chair frequently asked questions page, and on there you find your question. Why does the seat curve inward in the back? And the answer is, the seat curves inward in the back because the seat curves inward in the back. And now you understand why the seat curves inward in the back, which you didn't understand before. Again, this circular explanation can be a good explanation. Initially, you probably were wondering if there was some purpose for that curve in the back. You might have been wondering, is this supposed to be used as a toilet? Is that somehow going to help you pick up the chair and move it? Does it have some structural benefit? When you go to the FAQ and you see that their response is just this circular explanation, you realize, oh, it's just something they did. There isn't really anything useful or significant about it. It's just something they put on the chair. Now you understand. Your misunderstanding is cleared up. My final example is the example that's responsible for this project in the first place, and that is Me 1 versus Me 2 snooker. This might require some background before you can understand the example. So Richard Herring is a British comedian. In the 90s, he achieved a decent amount of success. He had 2 shows on the BBC, including one on BBC Two. He had multiple radio shows on BBC Radio, touring, and all of that. By the 2010s, he was doing Me One vs. Me Two Snooker. Me One vs. Me Two Snooker is a podcast where Richard Herring plays snooker against himself in his basement and comments on it himself. It's an audio-only podcast, so you can't actually see him playing snooker, and he's not very good at commentating on it, so you don't get a good sense of what's going on. In other words, it's an extremely pointless podcast. In one episode, he reflects on the fact that now he's playing snooker against himself in his basement, whereas before, he was successful and had television shows on the BBC. So he asks himself, why am I playing snooker against myself in my basement? And the response is, because I'm playing snooker against myself in my basement. That's why I'm playing snooker against myself in my basement. And so immediately when I heard this, first of all, I thought it was kind of funny. But second, I realized it's actually a good explanation. Because once you get this circular explanation, it all fits into place. If you think about how podcasts work, especially one like this, you have the complete freedom to do whatever you want. Podcasts, for the most part, are not run by big corporations who tell you what to do. This was him deciding what to do himself. And under those conditions, where he could do whatever he wanted, he decided to do one of the stupidest things imaginable, which is an audio podcast where he poorly comments on him playing against himself in snooker. And so it all fits together. It makes sense that he's reduced to doing this because he's the one who reduced himself to doing this. Once more, we have this circular explanation that actually is a good explanation. These are all successful explanations. They all achieve the desired explanatory understanding, and they all achieve it in the way intended. It's not just that one way or another the person ends up understanding after the person says what they say. It's specifically because they gave a circular explanation that the person in each example was able to understand. Before I get more into the details, I want to address the question of whether these really are circular explanations. There might be some question about that. It's plausible that they're genuinely circular because in each case, what was said as an explanation is identical to what was to be explained. The way it's typed out, it's the exact same sentence on both sides. P because P. So our default assumption should be, yes, this is a circular explanation. Now, there are considerations on the other side. First, I want to consider the objection from prosody. Premise 1, there is a change in prosody between first and second utterance in all of these supposedly circular explanations. Premise 2, a change in prosody often implies a change in meaning. Subconclusion, thus, the explanans and the explanandum are probably not the same in the examples above, so we can reach the conclusion, therefore the explanations are probably not truly circular. At least in certain respects, this is a very plausible objection. There certainly will be changes in prosody between the first and second utterance. There's going to be different intonation, different emphasis, so that first premise is quite plausible, almost certainly true. And the second premise is also highly plausible. We know that prosody does have an effect on linguistics. And this leads us to our conclusion that the explanation is probably not circular, because it leaves open the possibility that the explanans is not actually the same as the explanandum. That when the person says the same sentence as a response to the question, it takes on a different meaning. So it's not vacuous, it's not the same thing. There actually is different information in their response than was contained in the initial fact to be explained. My response to this is that there is no relevant difference. Prosody can produce differences, but not the kinds of differences that would mean this is not circular. First of all, here's a quote from a study on prosody from 2006. Changes in prosody typically create impressions, convey information about emotions or attitudes, or alter the salience of linguistically possible interpretations rather than conveying distinct propositions or concepts in their own right. So prosody generally indicates things like contrast, focus, syntax, or emotion. You'll find similar explanations about this in Wells's 2006 book about English intonation. The point here is that this is consistent with the same content on both sides of the explanation, and therefore circularity. So the point of this quote, and the point of what I'm saying here, is that usually the effect that prosody has is not on the propositional content of what is said. Now that can make a difference if you have something like syntactic ambiguity, but the sentences in the examples I gave were not syntactically ambiguous. There is no plausible case to be made that the barn collapsed under the weight of the snow has any kind of syntactic ambiguity that could mean the first utterance means something different from the second. And furthermore, these sentences are still comprehensible if you say them with no change in prosody. The barn collapsed under the weight of the snow because the barn collapsed under the weight of the snow. So that was my attempt to show that it's still comprehensible. I recorded myself saying the sentence once, then I recorded myself saying the word because, and then put them together. And even though it sounds weird, it's still entirely comprehensible. It doesn't destroy the sense that, oh yeah, this could be a good explanation. Once again, this is consistent with P having the same content on both sides of the explanation, and with it being a genuinely circular explanation. Next, we consider the objection from background knowledge. Maybe it's not there's a difference in what's explicitly said, maybe there's a difference in what's implied in a way that shows the explanation is not circular. And again, we can put this in argument form. Premise 1, these so-called circular explanations call to mind background knowledge. Premise 2, the background knowledge is what provides the actual explanation. Premise 3, the explanation provided by background knowledge is not going to be a circular explanation. So we can conclude these are not examples of good circular explanations. And you can verify that with what I said about all of the examples. Every example I gave appealed to some kind of background knowledge. When I tried to show that, yes, the person does come to understand what they wanted to understand as a result of the circular explanation, I always appealed to a lot of different background knowledge. For example, the barn collapsing under the weight of the snow. The reason that led to understanding is because that person knows things about barns and construction, maybe not a lot of detail, but enough to get the job done in this case. So you could argue that what looks like a circular explanation is not an explanation at all. What's really going on is the person is implicating a bunch of background information, and by implicating that through conversational implicature, that's how they're getting the explanation across. My first response to this is that background knowledge certainly does play a role in the conditions of success of the explanation, but that doesn't mean the explanation itself is not circular. Again, I'm focused on the act of explaining something, and the act of explaining that happened in each one of these examples is one where what is offered as explanation is the same as what is to be explained. I'm not focused on all the different necessary conditions of success. This includes things like background knowledge, of course, but it also includes things like survival, successful communication, and so on. Basically, what I'm arguing is that yes, background knowledge is necessary for these circular explanations to work, but so are several other factors, including survival. You can't explain anything to me successfully if I die immediately after asking for an explanation. But we don't therefore say my survival is part of the explanation for why the aristocratic party supports policies that hurt the poor. My survival is not part of the explanation for why the barn collapsed under the weight of the snow. A second response here is that often the background is not specific. The person who's giving the explanation doesn't need to know what knowledge the explainee has. The barn example is a good example of this. I deliberately set it up so that the person offering the explanation couldn't figure out why there was any question about why the barn fell. They couldn't figure out what exactly was missing. And this is a reason to give a circular explanation in the first place. Looking at the barn, you think it's completely obvious why this fell. I have no idea what you're lacking that's preventing you from explaining it. But I'm sure if I just give you the circular explanation, you will come to understand. This responds to the objection because it shows that we can't say that there's some particular explanation that's conveyed through conversational implicature because the person had no idea what they needed to convey. They had no idea what information they needed to implicate. They just had the sense that if I give them a circular explanation, it's gonna work. And so I think the attempt to use conversational implicature as a way of showing that they really are offering a non-circular explanation, I don't find that convincing. But this point leads us straight into why these are good explanations in the first place. As we've just seen, circular explanations can be useful in cases where there's an unclear request for explanation. Sometimes it's not clear why someone doesn't understand what they're seeking an explanation for. But also, sometimes in those cases, it can be clear that a circular explanation will give them the needed cognitive jolt to get them to understand exactly what they need to understand. We can think of explanatory context as a jolt to the system. When someone requests an explanation, this creates a context where the presentation of old information can produce new understanding. It's clear in all of these cases that what this person was given as an explanation for a fact is something they already knew. But because that fact is presented in a new context, it can create new understanding. And we're all, in some sense, aware of this. We're all intuitively aware of the context of explanation, and so sometimes you can be intuitively aware that I'm pretty sure if I just give them the circular explanation, they're going to understand. Part of the reason why this can work becomes clearer if we think about degrees of understanding. Understanding comes in degrees. But if we're just asking, does somebody understand why P? That requires being above a certain threshold of understanding. So understanding itself comes in degrees, but we can predicate it in an all or nothing way. Do they understand? Yes or no? In cases where somebody is asking for an explanation, they want to understand why P. In order to give them a successful explanation, you need to get them over the threshold for understanding why P. But the threshold is context specific, just as the demand for explanation is context specific. This helps our case because in some examples, like the examples given above, the threshold for understanding is low. And so in cases like that, circular explanation becomes a better candidate. You don't have to convey a huge amount of information. You don't have to get them to establish complicated connections among a lot of disparate information. It's just a very low stakes situation where it doesn't take much to satisfy their demand for explanation. It's not an exacting demand. It's not a rigorous demand for explanation. And so in cases like that, circular explanations can be good. If you have any doubts that the standards for explanation vary with context, there's a lot of research done on this. I have 4 studies listed here that all provide evidence that what counts as a good explanation depends on the context. This just explains why sometimes a weak explanation can be good enough. But we don't yet have an explanation for what's good about these circular explanations. To get us there, remember the pseudo-Gricean account of explanation. As a reminder, it says when S explains why P to R, generally, S utters Q with the intention of inducing in R understanding why P by means of the recognition of this intention. Even though most people probably couldn't put it in these terms, pretty much everyone at some level grasps that this is what's going on with explanations. that when you're dealing with a cooperative conversation partner and you ask them why P and they give you an answer, that this is what they're trying to do. They're trying to get you to understand why P, and part of how they're trying to get you to do that is by your recognition of their intention to get you to understand. So now let's put this together with implicature. I mean, we're talking about grace, so we've got to talk about implicatures, right? By offering a circular explanation, you convey through implicature that they already have enough information to understand. Because again, if you're a cooperative conversational partner and somebody's looking for an explanation and you offer them one, you're very much suggesting that this is sufficient. But by offering an explanation that only consists of what they already know, you're conveying to them that they already have everything they need to understand, and that by itself can clear up many misunderstandings. Think about the example of the Honus chair. The question was, why is there this big curve on the back of the seat? When you're told that you already have everything you need, you're not told anything about design goals or use or functionality or structure, that actually does give you the understanding that you need. Because you realize, I have no idea, I have no information about the structures or their design goals. So if I have everything I need, it must mean that there kind of wasn't any particular reason why they did this. That satisfies my need for understanding. Just to summarize where we are right now, I gave 4 examples of good circular explanations. I gave you what I hope are good reasons to think that they genuinely are circular explanations, and I explained how circular explanations can be good. To end, I want to consider the effects this result has on existing theories of explanation, so we know exactly how to situate this within debates about explanation. Most theories of explanation are simply going to explain away the core data in one way or another. The way this is generally going to work is that the implicatures that I talked about above inspire lines of thought that lead to the true causal model, if you're a causal theorist, or that lead to the true mechanistic model, if you prefer the mechanistic version of causal theories. Or the implicatures lead to the true unification, or the true statistical reasoning or statistical argument or statistical model, or lead to the true deduction from natural laws. So clearly, this is not going to be a surprise to anyone. None of the existing theories of explanation are going to say, oh, yes, these really are good examples of circular explanation. But they can take them on board in a weakened sense. They can say that what happens when somebody offers a circular explanation is there are these conversational implicatures that happen as I described above that leads someone to think of, to realize the true causal model or the mechanistic model and so on. This is to say, I don't think that these examples of good circular explanations are necessarily devastating to existing theories of explanation according to which circular explanations are impossible. I think they do have a response, this appeal to implicature. And part of what's going on here is I'm focused on something different from what these theories are focused on. These theories are primarily focused more on pairs of propositions. So when is P a good explanation for Q in this logical, context-neutral sense? I'm not trying to deal with that issue. I'm talking about the context where somebody offers an explanation to somebody else. Now, these theories don't really talk about that. They leave that for later work. So it isn't a significant problem for these theories. For those of you who are interested, here are some defenses of theories of explanation that would explain away my examples in terms of something like conversational implicature. You can find full details in the bibliography at the end of the video or in the description section. So all of these theories will have some way of dealing with the circular explanations that I gave. But that doesn't mean that the examples are meaningless. There's evidence from Hoyos and Gentner, 2017, suggesting that generating explanations, promotes learning. And according to all these theories above, when you offer a circular explanation, what you're doing is inspiring someone to create their own explanation, and thus you're inspiring learning. So there are still reasons why other theories could accept that offering a circular explanation can be a good way to explain something. Because not only does the person get the understanding that they need, because they have to put in some of the work themselves, that process can promote learning better than simply giving a more detailed, non-circular explanation. My point is, circular explanations can still be good if we're focused on the act of explaining, even if we accept one of these other theories of explanation in the more theoretical sense. But pragmatic theories of explanation are going to be more significantly affected. That's because pragmatic theories claim that explanations are defined by their effectiveness. In other words, in my terms, pragmatic theory says something is an explanation or a good explanation just in case it succeeds in producing understanding. Now, according to those theories then, in the above examples, a circular explanation really is effective. What succeeded in producing the understanding? Well, it was this directly circular explanation. Thus, according to pragmatic theories, circular explanations genuinely can be good, whereas other theories of explanation can simply explain away the examples. The nature of pragmatic theories means that they can't. So some examples of pragmatic theories of explanation include Achenstein, von Frossen, and Fay. The Toolbox account says that explanation means drawing from this toolbox full of tools that help produce understanding. And in that case, circular explanation could be one of the tools that sometimes works. And while Direct isn't really an example of a pragmatic account, he does talk about issues related to this in his forthcoming paper. Is this bad for pragmatic theories? I don't think so. I would say that this is good for circular explanations. With that, I want to thank you for watching this video. I wish I could have given it in person, but we all know why that wasn't possible. At least I got to get the talk out there, and I hope you got something from it. If you have any comments, just leave them below. I'll take a look at questions that people post or objections. This is a work in progress, so any information will be useful. Thank you, and have a good day. Just to close, I'm going to briefly run through my bibliography. Now, in the paper version of this, all of these works are cited. A lot of them didn't make it onto the slides, but I include all of them anyway. Yep, take a look at the citations. Maybe I should put these in the description. Yeah, I'll put them in the description. All right, that's it. Bye.